The blizzard didn't care if a man was a pauper or a king. It only cared if he could freeze. When the stranger stumbled into Martha's camp, he looked like death on two legs, with frost in his beard and boots worn through to the leather. She didn't ask for a coin, only his name, Caleb. She wrapped her only blanket around him and poured her last drop of coffee, thinking she was saving it. Helpless drifter. She had no way of knowing the 3,000 head of cattle surrounding them in the dark were his, or that her simple mercy was about to rewrite the fate of the entire territory. Before we ride deeper into the story, if the spirit of the old frontier still stirs your heart, the campfire tales, the courage, the dust, and the honor, then saddle up with us. Hit subscribe and ring the bell so you'll never miss another ride through the legends of the Wild West. Now, let's get back to the trail. But before the revelation of herds and fortunes, there was only the biting cold and the desperate solitude of a woman pushed to her limit. Martha sat huddled on the buckboard of her wagon, her knuckles white as bone against the reins, while the wind screamed like a banshee tearing through the canyons. She was 20 miles from Bighorn and 20 miles from the only hope she had left to save her land. The tax notice burned in her pocket, a cruel reminder of a debt she did not owe but had to pay. Every snowflake that lashed against her cheek felt like another penny stolen, another day lost. The wagon creaked in protest, the wood groaning under the assault of the gale, and for a moment she thought of turning back. But turning back meant surrender. It meant giving up the plot of earth where she had buried her husband and where she had promised to build a future. So she pressed on until the horses refused to take another step, their heads bowed against the onslaught, forcing her to make camp in the lee of a rocky outcrop that offered little shelter from the fury of the night. It was there in the heart of the whiteout that she saw him. At first he was nothing more than a shadow, a flicker of darkness against the endless gray. She rubbed her eyes, thinking the cold was playing tricks on her mind, making her see ghosts in the snow. But the shadow moved. It staggered. It fell and rose again with a determination that spoke of a man fighting his final battle. Martha didn't think, she didn't weigh the danger of a stranger in the wilderness, she simply reacted. She tied the reins and jumped down into the snow, the drift swallowing her up to her knees. The cold was a physical blow, a hammer striking the air from her lungs. She fought her way toward the figure, shouting against the wind, but her voice was snatched away before it could leave her lips. When she reached him, he was on his knees, his face turned toward the ground, his body surrendering to the inevitable. She grabbed his shoulder and he looked up, his eyes glassy and distant, the color of a winter sky. He tried to speak, but his jaw was frozen shut, his lips cracked and bleeding. "Come on," she urged, her voice rough with the cold. "You can't stay here. You'll die here." She pulled him up, draping his heavy arm over her shoulder, taking his weight, though he was nearly twice her size. It was a slow, agonizing trudge back to the wagon, every step a victory against the storm. He was dead weight, stumbling and sliding, his boat scraping uselessly against the ice. She could feel the cold radiating off him, a deep chill that seemed to seep into her own bones. They reached the wagon and she shoved him into the back among the sacks of feed and her few meager possessions. She climbed in after him, her hands shaking so badly she could barely strike the match to light the lantern. The small flame flickered to life, casting long dancing shadows against the canvas walls, illuminating the frost that clung to his eyelashes and the shallow rise and fall of his chest. He was alive, but only just. She looked at him, seeing not a threat but a mirror of her own desperation, a fellow traveler lost in a world that had grown too hard and too cold. She began to chafe his hands, trying to rub warmth back into the stiff fingers, unaware that the hands she held had signed checks that could buy her farm 100 times over. Outside, the wind howled in frustration, denied its prize, but Martha only tightened the blanket around him, her face set in a mask of grim determination. She had lost enough to this land. She would not lose him too. The interior of the canvas wagon felt like a small, fragile lung, breathing in and out with the rhythm of the storm outside. Martha sat on an overturned crate, watching the percolator tremble over the small camp stove, the blue flame hissing as if fighting for its own survival against the encroaching frost. The smell of the coffee was strong and bitter, a scent that usually signaled the start of a hard day's labor, but tonight it smelled like salvation. She poured the dark liquid into a tin cup, watching the stream thin and sputter until the pot was empty. It was the last of it, the very last grounds she had scraped from the bottom of the tin back in red rock, and she had been saving it for the morning, for the courage she would need to face the tax collector. But looking at the man shivering beneath her woolen blanket, she knew courage could wait. Survival could not. She moved to his side, the floorboards creaking under her worn boots, and held the cup to his lips, her hands steady despite the exhaustion that pulled at her eyelids. "Drink," she whispered, the command soft but absolute. Caleb's eyes fluttered open, unfocused and swimming with a haze of hypothermia. The heat of the steam hit his face, and for a moment he didn't know if he was in heaven or hell, only that the cold had finally stopped biting. He struggled to sit up, the blanket slipping from his shoulders to reveal a jacket made of fine, expensive leather, now ruined by water and salt. His hand trembled as he reached for the cup, but he paused, his gaze fixing on the woman's face. She looked tired, worn down by years of wind and worry, yet her eyes held a fierce, clear light that unsettled him. He was used to eyes that looked at him and saw dollar signs, saw average, saw a stepping stone to power. But she looked at him and saw only a man. The unfamiliarity of it made him reach instinctively for the one language he knew the world understood. He fumbled with his left hand, his fingers thick and clumsy, until he worked the heavy gold signet ring from his finger. It clattered onto the wooden floor, rolling in a small circle before coming to rest near her boot. "For the coffee," he croaked, his voice sounding like gravel grinding together. "It's gold. Real gold." Martha stared at the ring, then at him, and her expression hardened, not with greed but with a sharp, sudden offense that stung him more than the wind. She picked up the ring, feeling its weight, the cold metal form in her calloused palm. Then she reached out and pressed it firmly back into his hand, closing his fingers over it with a force that surprised him. "We don't sell kindness here, mister," she said, her voice flat and final. "And I don't trade a man's life for it. Drink it. Drink the coffee before it turns cold." Caleb stared at her, the ring burning a hole in his palm. He was Caleb Thorne, the man who owned the water rights from the chaotic braided rivers of the north to the dust bowls of the south. Men had killed for his favor. Women had lied for his attention. He had built an empire on the cynical truth that every man had a price and every kindness was a transaction waiting to be settled. Yet here in this rattle-trap wagon, in the middle of a god-forsaken blizzard, a woman with patched elbows and eyes full of sorrow was giving him her last drop of comfort and asking for absolutely nothing in return. It confused him. It terrified him. It stripped him of the armor he had worn for 20 years, leaving him feeling more naked than the storm ever could. He lifted the cup, his hand shaking, not from cold now, but from a strange, sudden shame. He drank the coffee, the bitterness warming his throat and settling in his gut like a heavy stone. He watched her turn back to the stove, her shoulders hunched against the draft, and he realized with a jolt that terrified him that he owed her something gold could never buy. He owed her his life, and for the first time in his memory, he wasn't sure if his life was worth the price she had unknowingly paid. The wind howled outside, battering the canvas like 1,000 angry fists, but inside the silence was heavy, thick with the weight of a death that had not been spoken but was already etched in stone. The darkness outside the canvas walls was absolute, a heavy, suffocating blackness that seemed to swallow the light of the lantern before it could reach the window. The storm had changed, its voice shifting from a high-pitched shriek to a low, guttural moan that vibrated in the floorboards beneath Martha's feet. She sat with her back against the grain sacks, her eyes heavy with a fatigue that felt like lead weight sewn into her eyelids. The silence inside the wagon was a fragile thing, constantly shattered by the assault of the wind, but underneath the howling there was something else. A rhythm. A steady, deep thumping that felt less like a sound and more like a heartbeat rising from the frozen earth itself. Thump. 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 It was slow and heavy, a geological pulse that seemed to synchronize with the blood rushing in her own ears. Martha rubbed her temples, telling herself it was the madness of the storm, the way the wind played tricks on a tired mind, turning gusts into voices and drafts into ghosts. She pulled the collar of her coat tighter, trying to shrink away from the noise, but it persisted, growing louder, not with volume but with pressure. It sounded like thunder rolling underground, like a mountain clearing its throat. Beside her, Caleb shifted restlessly in his fevered sleep, his brow slick with a cold sweat that defied the freezing air. He was lost in a landscape of his own making, a place of dust and heat that was a cruel memory in this white hell. His lips moved, forming silent words that were lost to the shadows. He wasn't in the wagon anymore. He was back in the saddle, back on the ridge overlooking the valley where the herd had scattered. In his delirium, the thumping wasn't the wind. It was the sound of 3,000 beasts moving as one, a living river of muscle and bone that he had promised to guide to salvation. The responsibility pressed on his chest, heavier than the blanket, heavier than the snow. He could hear the low, mournful lowing of the steers, a sound that wasn't quite a move but a deep, resonant vibration that traveled through the ground. To Martha, it sounded like the wind groaning through the rocks, but to Caleb it was the song of his failure. "They're lost," he muttered, his voice a cracked whisper that startled Martha in the gloom. "Scattered. The dark ate them." Martha leaned forward, placing a cool hand on his forehead, feeling the heat radiating from him like a furnace. "Hush now," she soothed, her voice trembling slightly. "There's nothing out there but the snow. You're dreaming." But Caleb shook his head, his eyes squeezing shut as if trying to block out a vision she couldn't see. "No. They're here. Can't you hear them? The ghosts. They're walking." Martha pulled her hand back, a shiver tracing its way down her spine that had nothing to do with the cold. She looked toward the back flap of the wagon where the canvas snapped and popped violently. For a terrifying second she thought she saw the fabric bulge inward as if something massive were pressing against it from the outside, something large and warm and breathing. The rhythmic thumping grew more distinct, gaining a texture that sounded terrifyingly like hoofs crunching through crusted snow. Thousands of them. It was impossible. No creature could survive in this whiteout, let alone a multitude. It had to be the wind drumming against the canyon walls, echoing and distorting until it sounded like a stampede in slow motion. She told herself this over and over, clutching her shawl to her chest, but the air in the wagon had changed. It felt charged, thick with the scent of wet wool and animal musk that shouldn't have been there. The isolation of the blizzard had stripped away the logic of the civilized world, leaving her alone in the dark with the delirious stranger and a sound that was slowly surrounding them, boxing them in with a wall of living noise. Martha reached for the lantern, turning the wick down until the flame was a mere speck, afraid that if she made the light too bright she might see what was waiting in the dark. She closed her eyes and listened to the phantom herd marching through the storm, praying that when morning came the world would make sense again, but fearing deep down that the storm had brought something ancient and unstoppable to her doorstep. The dawn didn't come softly, it arrived like a blade slicing through the heavy curtain of the night, instantly severing the bond between the howling dark and the frozen morning. One moment the world was a claustrophobic cacophony of wind and shadow where the universe ended at the canvas walls of the wagon, and the next it was a blinding, brilliant silence that rang in the ears louder than any scream. Martha woke with a violent start, the sudden stillness terrifying her more than the noise had ever dared to. She lay there for a long moment, listening to the creaking of the wood settling in the frost, her breath pluming before her face in the frigid air like smoke from a dying fire. The lantern had long since sputtered out, leaving a scorch mark on the glass, and the man across from her was sleeping deeply, his breathing even and strong. The fever had broken in the night, leaving him looking less like a corpse and more like a man who had wrestled a barren one, though he still bore the haggard gray look of someone who had touched the other side. She moved quietly, pushing aside the heavy canvas flap and shielding her eyes against the violent assault of the morning sun reflecting off a world buried in crystalline white. She expected to see the empty, desolate plains stretching out to the horizon, a vast emptiness of snow and rock where she was the only living thing for miles. She stepped onto the buckboard, rubbing the sleep from her grit-rimmed eyes, and looked out. Her heart stopped. It didn't skip a beat, it simply ceased to function for a terrifying second as her brain tried to comprehend the impossibility of what lay before her. They were everywhere. A sea of red and brown hides stretching as far as the eye could see, a living carpet that had smothered the snow and turned the valley into a teeming mass of life. 3,000 head of cattle stood motionless in the drifts, their breath rising in a collected cloud of steam that hung over the valley like a thick morning fog, masking the ground beneath them. They were silent, stoic statues carved from muscle and bone, watching her with dark, unblinking eyes that seemed to judge her presence in their domain. Martha gripped the rail of the wagon, her knuckles turning white as bone. This wasn't a herd, it was an invention. In her mind there was only one explanation for a gathering of this magnitude in such a remote and hidden place. Rustlers. She had stumbled right into the middle of a holding ground, a secret pocket where thieves hid their stolen fortunes before driving them south to the markets in Mexico. Panic clutched at her throat, dry and sharp. If they found her here, a witness to their crime, they wouldn't let her leave. She was about to scramble back inside to grab her rifle when the wagon shifted under a new weight. Caleb emerged, blinking against the glare, his hand gripping the canvas for support. He looked ragged, his beard matted and his clothes stiff with dried mud, but the haunting hollowness was gone from his cheeks. He stood beside her and she waited for him to gasp, to ask what was happening. But he said nothing. He just looked. His eyes scanned the horizon with a familiarity she couldn't place, counting the heads, noting the brands, checking the perimeter with the precision of a hawk. He saw the fear radiating off her, saw the way she scanned the ridges for gunmen, expecting death to ride down on them at any moment. He knew in that instant he could end her terror with 3 simple words. He could say, "They are mine." He could reveal that he was the king of this 4-legged kingdom and she was safe under his absolute protection. But he looked at her profile, the way her jaw set in defiance of the fear, and he held his tongue. He had been Caleb the king for too long, and it had made him lonely and suspicious. For one more hour he wanted to just be Caleb the Drifter, the man she had saved, not for his money but for his soul. He wanted to see how she faced the world when she thought she was alone against the odds. So he leaned against the wagon frame and played the part of the ignorant traveler, hiding the power he held in his pocket. "Looks like we've got company," he said, his voice rough but calm, a masterpiece of understatement that belied the thunderous pounding of his own heart as he realized his fortune had survived the night. Martha looked at him, incredulous at his calm. "Company," she hissed, pulling him back into the shadow of the canvas. "That's not company, mister. That's a death sentence. And we're sitting right in the middle of the jury." The tranquility of the frozen morning was shattered in an instant as the ridgeline erupted with movement, sending a jolt of terror through Martha that was colder than the blizzard itself. Riders appeared, cresting the snow-packed hill like dark apparitions born from the white silence, their horses kicking up plumes of powder as they descended with a speed that spoke of violence and intent. There were 6 of them, heavily armed with rifles scabbarded and revolvers resting low on their hips, their faces obscured by scarves and the brims of hats pulled low against the glare. The abrupt tonal shift from the majestic stillness of the herd to the sharp, deadly focus of the men turned the air electric. Martha scrambled back toward the wagon seat, her fingers fumbling for the old shotgun wrapped in an oilcloth beneath the bench, but before she could even bring the weapon to bear, the riders had encircled them. The lead rider reined his horse in so hard the animal reared, its iron-shod hoofs pawing the air just feet from where Martha stood trembling. He was a mountain of a man named Silas, a foreman with a face like dented leather and eyes that had seen too much hard weather and too little mercy. He leveled his gaze at the wagon, his hand resting casually but threateningly on the grip of his Colt. He didn't look at Martha first. His eyes went straight to the man standing beside the wheel. Silas's mouth opened to shout a name, to call out boss, in relief that the owner of the herd hadn't frozen to death in the canyon. But before the word could form, Caleb moved. It was a motion so subtle it would have been invisible to anyone who didn't know him, but to Silas it was a thunderclap. Caleb shifted his weight slightly, his eyes locking onto his foreman's with a steel-hard intensity, and he gave the barest shake of his head, accompanied by a single finger tapped against his thigh, the sign for silence. The signal was imperceptible to the others, but Silas froze, the recognition dying in his throat, replaced instantly by a confused, disciplined obedience. He swallowed the greeting and pivoted his aggression toward Martha, channeling his relief into anger. "You're blocking the pass, woman," Silas barked, his voice rough with the exhaustion of a night spent searching for lost cattle. "This is a drive, not a parking lot. Get this heap of kindling moving or we'll move it for you." Martha stiffened, her fear giving way to the indignation of the desperate. "My horses are spent," she countered, her voice shaking but loud. "They can't pull in this drift. We aren't moving until they're rested." Silas laughed, a harsh barking sound that had no humor in it. He leaned forward over the pommel of his saddle, his shadow falling over her. "You'll move it now or we'll cut the traces and push it off the ledge ourselves. We got 3,000 head to move and I ain't losing a dime for a squatter." He reached for his rope, intending to make good on the threat. That was when Caleb stepped forward. He didn't step forward as the man who signed Silas's paychecks. He stepped forward as a ragged drifter with nothing to his name but the coat on his back. He placed a hand on the wagon wheel, positioning himself between the horseman and the widow. "She said the horses are spent," Caleb said, his voice low and calm but carrying a resonance that cut through the wind. Silas looked down at his boss, trapped in a bizarre moral dilemma that made his eye twitch. He had to obey the man who owned him, but to obey him he had to let a nobody talk down to him in front of his crew. The other rider shifted uneasily, sensing this strange shift in power but not understanding its source. "You got something to say, Drifter?" Silas scowled, trying to maintain the charade while pleading with his eyes for Caleb to stop. "The wagon stays," Caleb said simply, his gaze never wavering. "Go around." The tension stretched in tight as a bowstring ready to snap. The crew watched, their hands hovering near their guns, waiting for the foreman to strike the drifter down for his insolence. But Silas just stared, locked in a silent battle of wills with the man who held his future in his hands. Finally, with a curse that was more frustration than anger, Silas yanked his reins, turning his horse away. "Go around, boys," he shouted, spitting into the snow. "But keep an eye on him. If that wagon isn't gone by noon, we'll burn it." As the riders moved off to flank the herd, Martha let out a breath she didn't know she was holding, looking at Caleb with a mixture of gratitude and suspicion, unaware that the man she was protecting had just given orders to his own army. While we catch our breath by this dusty road, go on and tip your hat to the last rodeo. Give this story a like and subscribe so you can ride with us again soon. All right then, let's get back on the trail. The great beast of the cattle drive began to move, a living river of horn and hide that flowed through the canyon with a momentum that felt less like animal instinct and more like a force of nature. Martha's wagon was no longer a solitary vessel stranded in the snow. It was a piece of driftwood caught in a flood, bobbing along amidst the sea of steers that bellowed and steamed in the morning light. The air was thick with the smell of wet fur and churned earth, the sound of 12,000 hooves creating a low thrumming vibration that traveled up through the wheels and settled into her bones. Caleb sat beside her on the narrow wooden bench, his shoulders brushing against hers with every jolt of the road. He had told her a lie, a simple, convenient untruth, that his horse had bolted in the night, spooked by the wolves, leaving him footsore and stranded. It was a flimsy excuse for a man who rode like a centaur, but Martha, in her relief at having a companion for the perilous journey to Bighorn, didn't question it. She snapped the reins, urging her tired team to match the plodding pace of the herd, grateful for the extra pair of eyes watching the trail ahead. For miles they rode in a comfortable silence, the kind that only exists between two people who have shared a brush with death. Slowly the silence gave way to words, quiet observations about the changing face of the territory. Caleb spoke of the fences going up in the south, of the iron rails cutting through the buffalo grass, speaking with a knowledge that seemed too vast for a drifter. He talked of how the open range was dying, how money was becoming the new law of the land, superseding the code of the gun. Martha listened, her eyes fixed on the horizon where the peaks of the Bighorn Mountains clawed at the sky. She spoke of the old days when a handshake was a contract and a neighbor was a lifeline, not a competitor. Her voice was stench with a bitterness that caught Caleb's attention, a sharp edge of grief that had not been smoothed down by time. He asked her why she fought so hard for a patch of dirt that the bank clearly wanted back, why she didn't just sell out and move to the city where the winters were kinder. It was a test, a question designed to see if she was like everyone else, holding out for a higher price. Martha didn't answer immediately. She looked down at her hands, rough and red from the cold, and then she pointed to a small locket that hung around her neck, a cheap piece of tin that held no picture. "It's not just dirt," she said, her voice cracking like thin ice. "My little girl, Sarah, she's out there, under the willow tree by the creek. She died the first winter we came here. The fever took her before the snow melted." Caleb felt the air leave his lungs. He looked at the woman beside him, seeing for the first time the sheer granite weight of her endurance. She wasn't fighting for profit. She wasn't fighting for pride. She was fighting because leaving the land meant leaving her child alone in the cold earth. It meant abandoning the only physical connection she had left to the love that had been stolen from her. "I promised her," Martha whispered, tears finally spilling over to freeze on her cheeks. "I promised I wouldn't leave her behind. I promised I'd keep the weeds off her grave and the wolves away from her stone. If I lose the land, I break my promise to my baby." Caleb looked away, staring out over the swaying backs of the cattle that represented his immense wealth. He felt a sickening lurch in his gut, a realization that his world of ledgers and profit margins was built on top of heartbreaks like this. He was the man who bought the land. He was the man who evicted the widows. He was the monster in her story, even if she didn't know it yet. A fire ignited in his chest, hot and fierce, burning away the last remnants of the cold, cynical businessman he had been. He looked at Martha, her profile etched against the harsh sunlight, and swore a silent oath that shook him to his core. He wouldn't just save her wagon. He wouldn't just buy her dinner. He would burn the whole corrupt system to the ground if that's what it took to keep her promise. He adjusted his hat, pulling the brim lower to hide the moisture in his own eyes, and gripped the edge of the seat, his resolve hardening into steel. "We'll get there, Martha," he said, his voice low and vibrating with a dangerous new power. "We'll get there. And nobody is going to take that land. Not today. Not ever. The wagon rolled on the wheels, groaning under the weight of the journey, carrying a mother's grief and a king's secret toward a town that was about to learn the true cost of greed. While the wind scoured the plains raw 20 miles to the south, the air inside the private office of Elias Thorne was warm and smelled of expensive tobacco and the dusty dryness of old ledgers. He stood by the frost-rimmed window looking out at the main street of Bighorn, which lay buried under 3 feet of fresh snow. To most men, the blizzard was a catastrophe, a white shroud that killed livestock and froze travelers in their tracks. But to Elias Thorne, the storm was a silent partner in the most profitable business deal of his life. He turned from the window and walked to the large map of the territory pinned to the wall behind his mahogany desk. It was a meticulously drawn chart of the valley with red circles drawn around specific parcels of land. His finger traced the line of the creek that wound through the foothills, stopping at a small insignificant square of land marked with the name Martha Higgins. It was a pitiful farm, barely enough to sustain a few goats and a garden, but beneath the rocky soil lay the only year-round spring in the lower valley. Thorne didn't see a widow's home or a child's grave. He saw a reservoir. He saw a dam that would control the water for 100 miles, allowing him to strangle the ranchers into submission and sell the liquid gold back to them at a price he alone dictated. But there was one obstacle standing between him and his empire of water, and that was the 3,000 head of cattle moving slowly toward the town. If that herd reached the railhead, if those beeves were sold and the money flowed into the local economy, every struggling sodbuster and starving rancher would have the coin to pay off their notes. The town would survive. Martha would pay her tax, and Thorne would be left with nothing but paper dreams. He sat down at his desk, the leather chair creaking under his weight, and looked at the clock ticking on the mantel. Noon tomorrow. That was the deadline for the tax payments. If the cattle didn't arrive by then, the land would forfeit to the bank, and the bank belonged to him. He picked up a small silver bell and rang it, a sharp, piercing sound that cut through the quiet of the office. The door opened and a man stepped in, a shadow, wearing a badge that was tarnished and pinned crookedly to his vest. It was Sheriff Miller, a man whose loyalty was bought with whiskey and the promise of continued employment. Thorne didn't offer him a seat. He simply steepled his fingers and looked at the lawman with eyes that were as flat and cold as the coins in his vault. "The storm is breaking," Thorne said, his voice smooth and cultivated, utterly at odds with the violence of his intent. "That means the herd will be moving again. They'll try to push through the pass to beat the deadline." Miller shifted his weight, his boots leaving puddles on the polished floor. "The pass is blocked with snow, Mr. Thorne. They'll have to dig their way through. It'll take them days." Thorne shook his head slowly, a small, cruel smile playing on his lips. "We can't rely on the snow alone, Sheriff. Hope is a dangerous thing, and desperation makes men work miracles. I want you to ride out to the Narrows with your deputies. Take the boys from the saloon, the ones who enjoy their work. Make sure that herd doesn't reach the town limits. Spook them. Scatter them. Drop a few trees across the road if you have to. I don't care how you do it, just make sure that when the clock strikes 12 tomorrow, Martha Higgins and every other debtor in this valley is standing here with empty pockets." Miller nodded, understanding the unspoken command beneath the polite words. It wasn't just about blocking the road, it was about ensuring ruin. As the sheriff left, closing the door against the draft, Thorne turned back to the map. He picked up a pen and drew a thick final line through Martha's name, the scratch of the nib sounding like a gate slamming shut. The blizzard had started the work, but he would finish it. The cold outside was nothing compared to the winter in his heart, where the only warmth came from the friction of gold rubbing against gold. The dry ground to a halt at the banks of the Washburn River, which had transformed from a lazy, meandering creek into a roaring monster of churning brown water and jagged ice flows. The blizzard had melted as quickly as it had arrived, sending a deluge of runoff crashing down from the high peaks, turning the ford into a death trap that churned with the debris of the storm. The cattle sensed the danger, their lowing turning into panicked bleats as they milled on the muddy bank, refusing to step into the swirling current that smelled of silt and violence. Caleb sat on the wagon bench, his eyes scanning the turbulent water, calculating the risk, knowing that every hour delayed was an hour closer to financial ruin for the woman beside him. But nature did not bargain, and the river did not care about tax deadlines. Suddenly a fissure opened in the massive bottoms near the water's edge, and a small calf barely a week old was jostled by the nervous herd. It slipped its hoof scrabbling uselessly against the slick mud before it tumbled into the icy water with a splash that was instantly swallowed by the roar of the current. To the drovers watching from their saddles, it was a minor loss of statistical inevitability, and a drive of 3,000 head and a $2 animal wasn't worth the risk of a man's life or a good horse. But Martha didn't see a $2 asset. She saw a frightened living thing crying out for help as it bobbed like a cork in the violent stream, its head barely clearing the frothing surface. Without a word, without a moment of hesitation to weigh the cost, she leapt from the wagon bench, her boots hitting the mud with a wet thud before she sprinted into the freezing water. "Martha!" Caleb shouted, his voice torn away by the wind, but she was already waist-deep, fighting the crushing weight of her sodden skirts as the current tried to drag her under. The cold was a physical shock, 1,000 needles piercing her skin, but she lunged forward, her hand closing around the cap's neck just as the river threatened to claim it. For a heartbeat she had it, but the river was greedy and strong. It swept her feet out from under her, and suddenly she was no longer a rescuer, but a victim spinning in the dark, freezing water, clutching the animal to her chest while the gray sky spun dizzyingly above her. She swallowed a mouthful of grit and ice, her strength failing against the relentless power of the flood. She prepared herself for the end, for the darkness to close in, but then the air above her whistled. A rope hissed through the spray, a serpentine line of hemp thrown with the precision of a master. The loop settled over her shoulders and tightened gently under her arms. The line went taut, singing with tension as Caleb dug his heels into the mud on the bank, his muscles straining against the combined weight of the woman, the calf, and the river. He hauled them in hand over hand, his face a mask of exertion and terror, until he dragged them gasping and shivering onto the solid earth. Martha lay in the mud, coughing up river water, her arms still wrapped protectively around the shivering calf. Caleb dropped to his knees beside her, not as a baron looking at a peasant, but as a man looking at a miracle. He reached out, pushing the wet hair from her face, his hand trembling. "You fool," he breathed, his voice rough with an emotion he couldn't name. "You damn fool. You could have died for a stray." Martha looked up at him, her teeth chattering violently, her lips blue but her eyes fierce and alive. "It's not a stray," she managed to choke out, her voice barely a whisper. "It's a life." Caleb froze, struck dumb by the simplicity of her creed. The cowhands who had ridden up to watch sat in silence on their horses, their hats pulled low, their expressions shifting from amusement to a solemn respect. They lived in a world where value was measured in weight and coin, where loss was a column in a letter. But as Caleb looked at Martha shivering in the mud, holding a worthless calf as if it were crown jewels, he realized she possessed a wealth he had never known. She valued life because it was life, not because it was profitable. In that moment, amidst the mud and the ice, the barrier between the rancher and the widow dissolved completely, replaced by a bond forged in the freezing water, a realization that while he owned the herd, she owned the heart to lead it. The night settled over the camp like a heavy wool blanket, suffocating the sounds of the day until there was only the crackle of the cedar logs burning in the pit and the distant, restless shifting of the herd. The firelight was a living thing in the center of the darker, frantic dancer in robes of orange and gold that pushed back the shadows but could not banish them entirely. Caleb sat on a flat rock, his hands extended toward the warmth, but the chill he felt wasn't from the mountain air. It was buried deep in his gut, a cold stone of guilt that grew heavier with every passing minute. He watched Martha across the flames. She was staring into the embers, her face softened by the golden glow, looking younger and less burdened by the weight of the crushing world. The firelight caught the stray strands of hair escaping her bun, turning them into filaments of spun copper, and for a moment Caleb felt an ache in his chest so acute it nearly stole his breath. He was living a lie, and the lie was poisoning the only pure thing he had found in years. To her he was Caleb the drifter, the man who needed saving, the equal who would pull the calf from the freezing river. To the world he was the baronet tyrant of the plains, the man who bought and sold futures with the stroke of a pen. He knew what she thought of men like that. He had heard the venom in her voice when she spoke of the bank, of the taxes, of the faceless powers that squeezed the life out of the poor to water their own gardens. If he told her the truth now, if he confessed that the 3,000 cattle sleeping in the dark were his, that the men guarding them were his private army, the light in her eyes would die. She would see him not as a friend but as the enemy. She would recoil, thinking his silence was a game, a rich man's cruel amusement at the expense of a widow's charity. The thought terrified him more than the blizzard ever had. He feared that look of betrayal more than he feared bankruptcy or death. But he couldn't keep it. The secret was a wall between them, growing taller with every mile they traveled, and he wanted to tear it down. He wanted to know if she could forgive him. He wanted to know if there was a place for him at her fire when the truth was laid bare and his pockets were full. He shifted his weight at the leather of his boots creaking in the quiet. He cleared his throat, the sound loud in the stillness. Martha looked up, her eyes questioning, trusting, waiting for him to speak. Caleb took a breath. It tasted of wood smoke and fear. "Martha," he said, his voice low, straining against the silence. There's something I haven't said. About the herd. About me." She waited. The wind held its breath. He leaned forward, his hands clasping together until the knuckles turned white. The words formed on his tongue, heavy and dangerous. "I'm not who you think I am. I am." The confession hung in the air, fragile as glass, waiting to be caught or shattered. Then it happened. A sound toward the night. Sharp. Loud. A crack like a whip. Then another. Gunfire. To the east. Close. Too close. Caleb stood up. His eyes went hard. The drifter vanished. The Baron returned. He kicked dirt on the fire. The light died. Darkness fell. "Get down," he ordered. "Now." "They're here." The darkness exploded. It wasn't just sound, it was a physical detonation of the night as muzzle flashes bloomed like deadly red orchids along the eastern ridge. The air instantly filled with the terrifying high-pitched whistle of bullets and the deeper bone-shaking rumble of 3,000 animals surging into blind panic. The stampede began not as a run but as a ripple, a wave of terrified muscle moving faster than thought, tearing the earth apart beneath 12,000 hooves. The ground beneath the wagon pitched and rolled like the deck of a ship in a gale, threatening to capsize Martha into the river of horns flowing past in the dark. She screamed, reaching for the brake lever, a useless gesture against the tide of beef and bone thundering past them, expecting to die beneath the crushing weight of the herd. But Caleb didn't scream. He didn't flinch. In the chaotic strobe light of the gunfire, the man who had huddled freezing in her blankets simply vanished, replaced instantly by a figure of iron and command. He vaulted from the wagon, not running for cover but sprinting directly toward the mayhem. He grabbed the bridle of a passing horse, a riderless gelding spooked by the noise, and swung himself into the saddle with a grace that belonged only to a man born on leather. He didn't look back at Martha. He looked at the chaos and he grabbed it by the throat. "Silas." Caleb's voice tore through the din, louder than the gunfire, deeper than the thunder of hooves. It wasn't a plea and it wasn't a suggestion. It was a hammer striking an anvil. "Flank the leaders. Turn them to the river. Don't let them break the gorge." It was the voice of absolute authority, the voice of a man who had moved armies of cattle across a continent and knew the soul of every beast in the herd. And the reaction was instantaneous. Silas, the foreman who had sneered at the drifter just hours before, spun his horse without a second of hesitation. "On it, boss." He yelled back, his defiance gone, replaced by the instinctual obedience of a soldier hearing his general. Other riders emerged from the gloom, confused and terrified, until they saw Caleb. They saw the set of his shoulders, the way he pointed to the breach in the line, and they fell into formation like iron filings snapping to a magnet. "Cut the left." Caleb roared, driving his horse into the crushing mass of the herd, using his lariat like a whip to turn the lead steer. "Hold the line, boys, or we'll lose it all." Martha sat frozen on the buckboard, her hands gripping the wood until splinters bit into her palms. She watched the scene unfold with a growing, horrifying clarity that chilled her more than the blizzard ever could. She watched the way the rough men who spat and cursed and bowed to no one, snapped to attention at his command. She saw the way the herd seemed to sense his presence, the chaos bending to his will. He wasn't a drifter. He wasn't a cowboy down on his luck. A drifter doesn't command a foreman. A pauper doesn't ride like a king. A stranger doesn't know the name of every man in the saddle. The realization hit her harder than the cold, washing over her with a nausea that had nothing to do with fear. The man she had saved, the man she had fed her last drop of coffee, the man she had pitied. He was the power. He was the money. He was the very thing she feared most in the world. She watched him ride through the smoke and the dust, a titan silhouetted against the flashes of gunfire, and felt the ground drop out from under her world. She hadn't saved a helpless soul. She had nursed a wolf and invited him into her sheepfold. The noise of the stampede was deafening, but in Martha's ears the silence was absolute, broken only by the shattering of the trust she had so foolishly given to a man who owned everything, including the lie he had lived beside her. While we catch our breath by this dusty road, go on and tip your hat to the last rodeo. Give this story a like and subscribe so you can ride with us again soon. All right then, let's get back on the trail. The last echo of the gunshot faded into the vast indifference of the plains, leaving behind a silence that was heavier and colder than the blizzard had ever been. The dust from the stampede hung in the silver moonlight, a choking fog that obscured the stars, but it could not hide the truth that stood stark and undeniable between the wagon and the man who had just saved it. Caleb rode back toward Martha, not with the slump of a frozen drifter, but with the straight-backed arrogance of a conqueror, his horse stepping high and nervous over the broken sagebrush. He pulled up beside the wheel and swung down his boots, hitting the earth with a sound of ownership that made Martha flinch. She stood by the buckboard, her arms wrapped around herself, not for warmth, but to hold her shattering world together. She looked at him, and for the first time she saw the cut of his clothes beneath the grime, the quality of the leather he wore, in the way the men in the distance watched him with fearful respect. He wasn't Caleb the palmer. He was a king in disguise, and she was the fool who had offered him a crust of bread. Caleb reached out a hand toward her, his expression open and pleading, wanting to bridge the chasm that had opened in the last 10 minutes. "Martha," he began, his voice rough with the residue of command. "We need to move. The herd is spooked and—" "Don't," she cut him off, her voice low and vibrating with a fury that stopped him dead. "Don't you dare give me orders. Not now. Not ever." She stepped down from the wagon, her eyes locking onto his with a ferocity that made him take a step back. "Who are you?" She demanded, the question hanging in the air like a blade. "You aren't a drifter. You aren't lost. Who are you?" Caleb looked at her, seeing the betrayal etched in every line of her face, and he knew the time for lies was done. "I am the owner of this drive," he said quietly. "I am the man who owns the grazing rights from here to the border. I am the money behind the market." Martha let out a harsh, bitter laugh that sounded like glass breaking. "You own it all," she whispered, her voice trembling with the shock of it. "The cattle, the men, the land. And yet you took my blanket. You drank my last drop of coffee. You let me fret and starve and pray over you while you sat on a fortune. Was it funny to you? Was it a game to see how much the poor widow would give before she broke? Did you laugh at me in the dark?" Caleb winced as if she had struck him, the accusation cutting deeper than any bullet. "No," he said, the word tearing out of him, desperate and raw. "It wasn't a game. It was a test. But not for you. For me." He stepped closer, his eyes burning with a need to make her understand the loneliness of his throne. "Everyone I know sees a wallet when they look at me. They see a target or a payout or a stepping stone. When you found me in the snow, you didn't know my name. You didn't know my worth. You saved me because I was a human being. I needed to know. I needed to know if that still existed. I needed to feel like I was worth saving just for being Caleb." Martha looked at him, and the tragedy of it was that she believed him, but it didn't change the sting of the lie. It didn't change the fact that he had held the power to solve all her problems while watching her suffer. "You wanted to feel human," she said, her voice thick with tears she refused to shed. "So you used my heart to do it. You used my fear to make yourself feel better. That isn't being a man, Caleb. That's being a thief." She turned her back on him, climbing up to the wagon seat with a dignity that shamed him, pulling the canvas flap closed between them like a heavy curtain. "Ride with your men," she said through the fabric, her voice muffled but final. "My wagon is for folks who need it. And you don't need anything from me." Caleb stood alone in the dust, watching the woman who had saved his life close her heart to him, realizing too late that while he had saved his herd, he had lost the only thing that mattered. The distance between the saddle and the wagon seat was suddenly a canyon he could not cross. The town of Big Horn appeared on the horizon like a promise carved out of wood and stone, its church steeple rising above the snow-dusted plains as a beacon of civilization after the savagery of the blizzard. To the weary drovers and the exhausted cattle it looked like rest, but to Martha Higgins, gripping the reins of her wagon with trembling hands, it looked like salvation. She checked the position of the sun. It was high, climbing toward its zenith. 11 o'clock. She had 1 hour. 1 hour to reach the clerk's office, 1 hour to hand over the coin, 1 hour to keep her promise to her dead child. The relief that washed over her was so intense it made her dizzy, but as the lead steers crested the final rise, the momentum of the drive slammed into a wall, a sudden confused silence. The road ahead, the only artery leading into the valley, was choked off. A barricade of felled pine logs and upturned carts stretched across the trail, manned by a dozen men with shotguns resting in the crooks of their arms. At the center sat Sheriff Miller on a roan mare, his badge glinting in the harsh sunlight like a tarnished star. Caleb rode to the front, his face a mask of thunder. He didn't need to ask who had ordered this. The smell of Thorne's corruption was stronger than the scent of the cattle. "Move aside, Miller," Caleb ordered, his voice tight with the effort of holding back his rage. "We have a market to make." The sheriff didn't budge. He spat a stream of tobacco juice into the snow, a dark stain on the white purity of the morning. "Can't do that, Thorne," he drawled, his voice carrying a mocking weight that drifted back to where Martha sat frozen on her bench. "We got reports. Bad blood. They say this herd is carrying the fever. Quarantine orders. Nobody in, nobody out until the vet comes up from Santa Fe." It was a lie so bold and so transparent it took Caleb's breath away. The vet from Santa Fe was a week's ride away. By the time he arrived, the tax deadline would be a distant memory. Martha's farm would be sold and Caleb's beef would be gaunt skeletons stripped of their value. It was a siege laid without a single cannon, a blockade built of paper and perjury. Caleb looked past the sheriff to the town clock visible just over the rooftops. The hand stood at 11:05. He looked back at the wagon trapped behind a wall of 3,000 milling steers, unable to go forward, unable to go back. He saw Martha standing on the buckboard, her face pale as milk, her eyes fixed on the church steeple. She knew. She knew this wasn't about disease. This was the trap snapping shut. This was the rich man's game played with loaded dice. "You know this herd is clean," Caleb snarled, his hand drifting toward his hip. "This is about the land. Let the wagon through, Miller. She has business." The sheriff shook his head, slowly leveling his shotgun. "No exceptions. Quarantine means quarantine. You cross this line, we open fire. And if we shoot, the cattle stampede. And if they stampede, well, that little wagon won't look like much more than kindling when the dust settles." Caleb froze. He looked at his men, their hands hovering over their weapons, ready to die for him. He looked at the sheriff, ready to kill for a paycheck. And he looked at Martha, trapped in the middle, the innocent casualty of a war she hadn't chosen. The deadline hung over them like an executioner's axe. The road was blocked, the law was bought, and the clock was ticking down the final minutes of a widow's hope. For all his money and all his power, Caleb Thorne was helpless, paralyzed by the threat of violence against the woman he had sworn to protect. Caleb looked from the smug face of the sheriff to the desperate eyes of the woman on the wagon, and in that fractured second the calculation of his life shifted from gold to granite. He realized that no checkbook could buy passage through a wall of corruption, and no title deed could command respect for men who sold their badges for silver. This wasn't a transaction to be negotiated, it was a war to be won. He turned his gaze to Martha, holding her eyes with a quiet, ferocious intensity that spoke louder than any shout. In that look there was an apology for the deception and a promise of the violence to come, a silent agreement that if they were to go down, they would go down amidst the thunder of 1,000 hooves. She nodded, a single sharp dip of her chin that said, "I am ready." Caleb turned back to the blockade, his hand raising not to his gun but to the sky. "Walk them through," he roared, his voice cracking like a whip over the heads of the nervous steers. "Don't run them. Walk them. Flood the street." Silas and the drovers understood instantly, spurred by the audacity of the command. They didn't fire their weapons, they fired their throats, whistling and shouting, driving the massive wedge of the herd forward like a slow-moving glacier. The sheriff's men raised their shotguns, but hesitation flickered in their eyes, terrifying and absolute. They could stop a wagon. They could shoot a man. But they could not stop a living tidal wave of 3,000 confused and angry beasts pressing against the timber. The herd hit the barricade not with a crash but with the inexorable pressure of a rising river. Logs snapped, carts were shoved aside, and the line broke. The deputies scrambled for the safety of the boardwalks, diving out of the way as the street filled wall to wall with heaving flanks and tossing horns. It was a scene of magnificent, terrifying chaos, a cinematic explosion of the wild frontier crashing into the orderly lie of the town. Horns scraped against the painted siding of the general store. Windows rattled in their frames from the vibration, and the air filled with the thick, pungent smell of the drive. The cattle bawled their confusion, creating a wall of sound that drowned out the sheriff's impotent cursing as their boardwalk shook under the assault. Caleb rode flank on Martha's wagon, his horse dancing sideways to keep the steers from crushing her wheels, his eyes scanning the rooftops for riflemen, his presence a shield of iron around her fragile wooden vessel. He wasn't the Baron now, he was the outrider for a queen, protecting her passage through the crushing tide. Martha didn't look left or right. She kept her eyes fixed on the back at the end of the street, the clock tower looming above it, the hands ticking relentlessly toward judgment. She snapped the reins, her face set in a mask of terrifying determination, her wagon wheels rattling over the broken debris of the blockade, surfing the wake of the lead bull like a ship navigating a hurricane. She was no longer just a widow fighting for a plot of dirt. She was the spear point of a revolution, driving a wedge of wild justice right through the heart of a corrupt town. While the ground shook and the world watched in breathless wonder, the heavy oak doors of the First National Bank of Bighorn burst open, not with the polite chime of a customer entering for business, but with the violent force of a raid. The chaotic roar of the stampede outside was muffled to a dull throbbing vibration through the thick plate glass, but inside the air remained stiflingly still, smelling of stale ink and unchecked avarice. Elias Thorne stood behind the polished brass railing, his gold pocket watch in his hand, a smirk frozen on his pale face as the minute hand clicked ominously onto the 12. He had been expecting a weeping widow begging for a hopeless extension on her knees, but what he got was a storm walking through his front door. Martha marched in first, her worn boots leaving muddy tracks on the pristine imported carpet, her head held high despite the exhaustion that pulled at her bones like gravity. Beside her loomed Caleb, a figure of dust and fury, his coat torn from the drive, his presence filling the room like a thunderhead charged with lightning. Thorne sneered, snapping his watch shut with a decisive metallic click that sounded like a jail cell closing. "You're too late, Mrs. Higgins," he announced, his voice smooth as oil and dripping with false regret. "The deadline has passed. The property is forfeited to the bank. Sheriff, arrest these vagrants for disturbing the peace and blocking a public thoroughfare." He waved a manicured hand toward the door, expecting the law to do his bidding instantly. But the sheriff didn't come. Instead, the large windows darkened as the writhing mass of cattle pressed their bodies against the building, effectively sealing the bank in a prison of living beef. Caleb stepped forward, his spurs ringing on the marble floor, a sharp, desolate sound that made the clerks shrink back against the wall. "There will be no arrests today, Elias," Caleb said, his voice low and vibrating with the absolute authority he had hidden for so long under the guise of a drifter. "And there will be no forfeiture." Thorne laughed, a nervous, high-pitched sound that bounced off the high ceiling. "And who are you to stop it? A drift rider with a stolen herd? I'll have you hanged for rustling before the sun sets." Caleb reached into his inner coat pocket, not for a gun but for a leather wallet thick and worn by years of travel. He pulled out a folded document, unfolding it with a deliberate, terrifying slowness that commanded the gaze of everyone in the room. "I am Caleb Thorne," he said, the name landing in the quiet room like a judge's gavel. "And you are sitting in my chair, cousin." The color drained from Elias's face, leaving him looking like a wax doll left too near the fire. He knew the name. Everyone in the financial world knew the name. It was the name on the bank's charter, the name on the loans, the name that only the dead Elias was leveraging to squeeze the valley dry. Caleb slammed the document onto the counter. "I own the note on this bank, Elias, and as of this moment I am calling it in. Unless," he paused, letting the silence stretch until it screamed with tension, "unless you process this payment immediately." He slapped a stack of gold coins onto the counter, the payment for Martha's land ringing out like church bells. Elias stared at the gold, then at the man he had dismissed as a pauper, his hands shaking as he reached for the stamp. Martha stood frozen beside Caleb, her small, weary frame dwarfed by his massive bulk, but in that moment they were giants of equal measure. The rough rancher and the stubborn widow stood shoulder to shoulder, the visual embodiment of the raw power of the frontier and the enduring, unshakable heart of the home. She watched as the stamp came down, paid in full, the red ink looking brighter than blood on the page. It was done. The paper war was won by the man who smelled of sagebrush and the woman who wouldn't let go of her promise. Caleb turned to her, and for the first time since the betrayal in the snow, his eyes were soft, stripped of the Baron's armor. "It's yours, Martha," he whispered, the words meant only for her. "The land, the water, the grave, it's all yours." And as the roar of the cattle outside signaled their victory, Martha realized that the man beside her hadn't just bought her land, he'd bridged the impossible distance between their worlds, proving that honor could exist even in a palace of greed. The winter snows did not hold their grip forever, for even the harshest season must eventually bow to the persistence of the sun. The white blanket that had nearly become a shroud for two lost souls melted away into the swollen creeks, feeding the thirsty earth until the valley of Bighorn exploded in a riot of wildflowers and waist-high buffalo grass. The wind that had once screamed like a banshee now whispered through the cottonwoods, carrying the scent of sage and damp soiled perfume of life that replaced the sterile odor of the crust. On the porch of the farmhouse that had once been on the auction block, Martha Higgins stood watching the morning light spill over the ridges. She looked different now. The pinch of starvation was gone from her cheeks, replaced by the glow of a woman who knew her larder was full and her boundaries were secure. The farm was no longer a place of desperate survival, but a thriving heart of the valley. New fences painted wide and strong crisscrossed the pastures, holding in a small herd of prize breeding stock that bore the combined brand of the Higgins homestead and the Thorne Empire. Down by the creek where the willow tree shaded the small stone marker of her daughter's grave, the weeds were gone, replaced by a bed of carefully tended bluebells. And kneeling there, hat in hand, was not a hired hand or a passing stranger, but Caleb. He had traded his silk suits for denim in his boardroom for the saddle, finding that the peace he had sought all his life was not in the accumulation of numbers, but in the quiet rhythm of the seasons. He wasn't just a silent partner in the deed. He was a partner in the life they built together, a man who had found his home not in a mansion but in the warmth of the widow's kitchen. He stood up, dusting the soil from his knees, and looked toward the house, raising a hand in a greeting that needed no words. It was a simple gesture, but it carried the weight of a miracle. As the camera pulls back, rising high above the valley, capturing the green expanse of the land saved by a single act of mercy, the narration reflects on the terrifying fragility of fate. One night, one decision, one moment where a woman chose to open her heart instead of closing her door. If Martha had driven past that snowdrift, if she had hoarded her coffee, if she had let fear dictate her actions, the valley would have been drained dry by greed, and two souls would have remained frozen in their separate solitudes. The blizzard had tried to bury them, but instead it had planted a seed that grew into a legacy of kindness that would outlast the stone of the mountains. It is a reminder that the greatest power in the West wasn't the gun or the gold or the stampede. It was the quiet, unconquerable strength of human compassion. The fire she lit that night in the drafty wagon didn't just warm a shivering man. It ignited a light that drove back the shadows of an entire territory, proving that even in the coldest winter, love is the only fuel that never burns out. So as the sun sets on this valley, turning the sky to fire and gold, ask yourself this one question. If a stranger knocked on your door in the freezing dark, would you have given them your last blanket? Because Martha did, and it cost her nothing but her lonely heart. If this story stirred a memory or two, saddle up with us again. Hit subscribe and help keep these old frontier tales alive. Out here, every name, every trail, every sunset still matters. So till we meet again, friend, keep your hat tipped to the past and your heart pointed west.